Before I begin this story, a story I never thought I'd have to tell, I want to thank you for being here. My son, Mark, the boy I poured my entire life into, told his wife, Susan, that I wouldn't live forever, and frankly, they sounded eager for that day to come. He thought I was fading away, a problem soon to be solved. But I wasn't finished, not by a long shot. This is how I made sure he'd remember me, not as a burden, but as the woman who taught him his most unforgettable lesson. Let me know in the comments if you've ever felt underestimated by those closest to you. My name is Eleanor, though most people who knew me well called me Ellie. I suppose, looking back, Mark and his wife, Susan, never really knew me well at all, or perhaps they only saw the parts of me they wanted to see, the parts that were convenient for them. For decades, I was Mark's mother, a role I cherished, a role I dedicated my life to, especially after his father, my dear Arthur, passed away far too soon. Mark was only 12 then, a tender age to lose a parent, and I vowed to be both mother and father to him, to ensure he never felt the lack, to give him every opportunity Arthur and I had dreamed of for him. I remember the endless sports practices, the late-night study sessions where I'd make him cocoa and quiz him on his history notes, the sacrifices I made, small and large. Selling Arthur's beloved vintage car, a pang I still felt, to afford that prestigious summer program that Mark swore would get him into the best university. Postponing repairs on our home, the home Arthur and I had built with such love, so that Mark's tuition was always paid on time. These weren't burdens to me then, they were acts of love, threads in the tapestry of motherhood. I believed, with all my heart, that he saw them, understood them, cherished them as I did. The house itself, a sprawling old Victorian with a wraparound porch and a garden Arthur had meticulously planned, was more than just bricks and mortar. It was a repository of memories, laughter, a few tears, and the scent of Arthur's pipe tobacco that sometimes, on quiet evenings, I could still faintly imagine. It was meant to be Mark's legacy, his inheritance, a tangible piece of his father and me. I'd always envisioned him raising his own family there, perhaps with children, who would play in the same garden I'd watched him grow up in. Such foolish, sentimental dreams, it turned out. Mark met Susan in his final year of college. She was ambitious, sharp-tongued, and, I had to admit, quite striking. I tried to like her, for Mark's sake. I welcomed her into our home, shared my recipes, told her stories about Mark's childhood, hoping to build a bridge. But there was always a coolness about her, a calculating glint in her eyes that I chose to ignore, attributing it to youthful ambition, or perhaps a different upbringing. They married a year after graduation, a lavish affair that I helped finance, stretching my already modest savings. They moved into a trendy apartment downtown, and my visits, initially frequent, became less so. They were busy, they said, building their careers. I understood. I had my own life, my friends, my garden, my memories. Yet, a small part of me felt a growing distance, a subtle shift in Mark's demeanor when Susan was around. He was quicker to agree with her, sometimes at the expense of a long-held family tradition or a casual plan we'd made. I'd recently turned 75. My health was generally good, though a touch of arthritis made gardening a bit more challenging, and my energy wasn't what it once was. I was still sharp, my mind clear, but I suppose to younger eyes, the silver in my hair and the slower pace of my steps might have screamed frail or fading. Their visits had become more frequent in the past year, which I initially took as a sign of renewed affection. A desire to spend more time with me in my twilight years, as Susan once put it. A phrase that sent a small, unpleasant shiver down my spine. They'd bring groceries, which was thoughtful, but then Susan would subtly rearrange my kitchen, muttering about inefficiency. Mark would eye the sagging porch railing or the slightly peeling paint on the window frames with a look that wasn't concern, but something more akin to assessment, like a valuator sizing up a property. I started to feel less like a mother in her own home, and more like a caretaker of an asset they were waiting to inherit. The conversations increasingly veered towards my future comfort, suggestions about downsizing, or finding a place with less upkeep. I'd always politely deflected, saying I was perfectly happy where I was, that Arthur's Rosa still needed me. But the pressure, subtle yet persistent, was there. It was like a slow tide, eroding the shores of my comfort, my autonomy. I still remember the warmth of Arthur's hand in mine when we first walked through the door of this house, the sheer joy on his face. "This is it, Ellie," he'd said. "This is where our story will unfold," and it had, for so many years. The thought of anyone, even Mark, looking at it with cold, calculating eyes, made my heart ache with a grief I couldn't quite name. It was a betrayal not just of me, but of Arthur, of everything we had built. I started to notice other things too, small dismissals, impatient sighs when I'd tell a story they'd heard before, the way their eyes would meet over my head when I expressed an opinion that differed from theirs. It was a campaign of subtle invalidation, and I, in my naivety, my desperate desire to believe in the goodness of my son, had been slow to recognize it for what it was. The foundations of my world were trembling, but the earthquake was yet to come. The day it happened was an ordinary Tuesday. Mark and Susan had called to say they were dropping by with some paperwork they needed my signature on, something about consolidating some old utility accounts, Mark had said vaguely. I'd made tea and laid out some of the lemon poppyseed muffins Arthur used to love. I was in the sunroom, tending to my African violets, when they arrived. They let themselves in, their voices carrying from the hallway. I heard Susan say, "Just get her to sign it quickly, Mark. I want to get to that gallery opening before 7-inch." Mark's reply was lower, but the sunroom door was slightly ajar, and sound travels in old houses. "Relax, Susan. It's not like she's going anywhere. Besides," and here his voice dropped further, taking on a conspiratorial, almost weary tone, "Mom won't live forever." My breath hitched. I froze, my hand hovering over a violet, the small watering can suddenly feeling like lead. It wasn't just the words, it was the casualness, the undercurrent of impatience, as if my continued existence was an inconvenience they were politely tolerating. Then Susan's voice, crisp and clear, laced with something that sounded chillingly like anticipation, "No, she certainly won't. And then we can finally sell this old mausoleum, and get that place in the Cotswolds we've been dreaming about. Imagine, Mark, no more guilt trips about visiting, no more dusty antiques." A small, dry laugh followed. I stood there, rooted to the spot, the blood draining from my face, then rushing back in a hot, painful wave. Mausoleum. Dusty antiques. Guilt trips. Was that all I was to them? All this house represented? The watering can slipped from my numb fingers and clattered onto the tiled floor, water splashing around my feet. Neither of them heard it, or if they did, they paid it no mind, their conversation moving on to the details of their Cotswolds fantasy. I felt a sharp, physical pain in my chest, as if a shard of ice had pierced my heart. My son, my Mark, the little boy whose scraped knees I had kissed better, whose nightmares I had soothed, was waiting for me to die. And his wife was cheering him on. The muffins sat on the table, a symbol of a love that now felt like a cruel joke. The scent of lemon and poppyseed, once a comfort, now seemed cloying, suffocating. I slowly backed away from the door, my knees trembling. I couldn't face them, not then. I slipped out the back door, into the garden, Arthur's sanctuary. The roses, his beloved peace roses, were in bloom, their creamy petals edged with a delicate pink. I sank onto the old stone bench, hidden from the house by a thicket of lilac bushes, and the tears I hadn't realized I was holding back began to flow. They weren't loud, dramatic sobs, but silent, scalding tears that carved paths down my cheeks. Each drop felt like a memory dissolving, a hope turning to ash. How could he? How could the boy who used to bring me hand-picked daisies, his face beaming with pride, turn into this stranger who discussed my demise with such cold pragmatism? The betrayal was a living thing, coiling in my stomach, tightening my throat. I replayed his words, "Mom won't live forever," over and over again. It wasn't the truth of the statement that wounded me, I was well aware of my own mortality. It was the intent behind it, the shared glance with Susan that I could imagine, the relief in their tone. I was a problem to be managed, an obstacle to their dreams. My life, my home, everything I held dear, was merely a stepping stone for them. The initial shock gave way to a profound, cavernous grief, a mourning for the son I thought I had, for the love I believed was unconditional. That afternoon, sitting amongst Arthur's roses, something within me fractured, but something else, something hard and resolute, began to form in its place. The pain was immense, but through it, a tiny, cold spark of clarity started to ignite. They had made their feelings clear. Now, I had to decide what to do with that devastating knowledge. The sun began to set, casting long shadows across the garden, and I knew, with a chilling certainty, that nothing would ever be the same again. The scent of the roses suddenly seemed stronger, more defiant, and I drew a shaky breath, the first step towards a path I hadn't chosen, but now had to walk. The days that followed were a blur of forced smiles and hollow interactions. Mark and Susan had eventually found me in the garden that Tuesday, feigning concern when they saw my tear-streaked face. I'd mumbled something about feeling overwhelmed, a headache, anything to avoid the truth that was clawing at my insides. They exchanged a look, pity, perhaps, or maybe just impatience, and Susan had gently patted my arm, saying, "You should rest, Eleanor. Don't worry about those papers today." The condescension in her voice was a fresh twist of the knife. I let them believe I was just a tired old woman, easily flustered. It was safer that way, for now. But alone in the quiet of my home, the silence amplified their words, their callousness echoing in every room. Sleep became a luxury, my nights filled with replaying that conversation, dissecting every nuance, every inflection. I'd lie in bed, staring at the ceiling where the moonlight cast shifting patterns, and wonder where I had gone wrong. Had I loved Mark too much? Shielded him too fiercely? Had my sacrifices inadvertently bred not gratitude, but a sense of entitlement so profound that he could anticipate my death with such detachment? The pain was a constant companion, a dull ache behind my eyes, a tightness in my chest. I found myself looking at old photographs, searching for clues. There was Mark, a gap-toothed 7-year-old, proudly holding up a finger painting for me. Mark at his high school graduation, his arm around my shoulders, both of us beaming. Mark on his wedding day, handsome and happy, or so I had thought. Where was the boy in those pictures? When had he been replaced by this cool-eyed stranger? I started to observe them with a new, painful clarity. Their helpful visits took on a sinister hue. Susan's comments about the house being too much for me now sounded less like concern, and more like a strategic campaign. Mark's questions about my finances, my will, my insurance policies, which I had once dismissed as practical, now felt like prying, like an inventory of assets. I remembered an incident a few months prior. I'd been telling them about a small investment Arthur had made, one that had matured nicely. Mark had listened intently, and then Susan had chimed in, "Oh, that's wonderful, Eleanor. You should really consider putting that towards something practical, like an annuity that could help with, well, future care needs." At the time, I'd thought it was sensible advice. Now, it felt like they were already allocating my resources, planning my decline. The turning point, the moment the lingering fog of grief and disbelief finally lifted to reveal a steely resolve, came about 3 weeks after that fateful Tuesday. They had invited themselves over for Sunday dinner. I'd made roast chicken, Mark's favorite. The conversation was strained, at least for me. I was polite, reserved, watching them. After dinner, as I was clearing the plates, Susan followed me into the kitchen. "Eleanor," she began, her voice smooth as silk, "Mark and I have been talking, and we are really worried about you rattling around in this big house all alone. We found this lovely assisted living community, Golden Meadows, not too far from us. They have wonderful facilities, social activities." She painted a picture of sterile, communal living, a place where I would be safe, and looked after. My heart pounded. Golden Meadows. It sounded like a pasture where old horses were put out to graze before the inevitable. Mark walked in then, placing an arm around Susan's shoulders, a united front. "Mom, it makes sense," he said, his tone earnest but firm. "You wouldn't have to worry about repairs, or the garden, or being lonely. We could sell the house, invest the money for your care. It would be a load off everyone's mind, especially yours, a load off their minds, more like." They had brochures. Bright, glossy brochures showing smiling, silver-haired seniors playing bingo, and eating cafeteria food. The casual cruelty of it, the presumption, the utter disregard for my feelings, my history, my connection to this home, was staggering. They weren't just waiting for me to die, they were actively trying to usher me out of my own life, to dismantle it piece by piece while I was still breathing. I looked from Mark's earnest, persuasive face to Susan's expectant one, and something snapped. The hurt was still there, a deep, aching wound, but now it was accompanied by a cold, clear anger. Not a raging, shouting anger, but a quiet, focused fury. They saw me as a relic, a problem to be solved, an asset to be liquidated. They thought I was too old, too tired, too sentimental to fight back. They were wrong. "Thank you for your concern," I said, my voice surprisingly steady. "I'll certainly think about it." I took the brochures, my hand not trembling. Inside, I was a tempest, but outwardly, I projected calm. They smiled, relieved, believing they had planted a seed that would soon sprout into compliance. That night, I didn't cry. I sat in Arthur's old leather armchair, the brochures for Golden Meadows on the ottoman in front of me, and I thought. I thought about Arthur, about the life we'd built, the sacrifices I'd made, the son I had raised. And I thought about what they were trying to do to me. The pain of their betrayal had been a blinding fog, but now, it was a lens, sharpening my focus. They had underestimated me. They had mistaken my love for weakness, my grief for senility. They believed I was finished. But I, Eleanor Vance, was not finished. Not by a long shot. A plan began to form, not a plan for revenge in the petty sense, but a plan for justice, for self-preservation, for reclaiming my dignity and my life. The first step was to understand exactly what I was up against, and what resources I truly had at my disposal. The old Ellie, the trusting, self-sacrificing mother, was gone, shattered by her son's callous words. In her place, a new Eleanor was emerging, one who was more cautious, more strategic, and infinitely more determined. They wanted me to fade away. I would show them what it truly meant to be remembered. The decision to act, to truly fight back, was like a switch being flipped. The sorrow was still there, a dull ache in the background of my days, but it no longer paralyzed me. Instead, it fueled a quiet determination I hadn't felt in years, perhaps not since Arthur's passing, when I'd had to muster all my strength to keep our family afloat. My first concrete step was to find a lawyer. Not just any lawyer, but someone sharp, discreet, and preferably, someone Mark and Susan wouldn't know or expect. I spent a few days researching online, looking for specialists in estate planning and elder law. I discounted the large, imposing firms downtown that Mark might be familiar with through his own work in finance. I needed someone more personal, someone who would understand the nuances of my situation. Finally, I found a name that resonated: Monica Holloway. Her office was in a smaller, charming part of town. Her website spoke of personalized service and a commitment to her clients' well-being. There was a picture of her, a woman perhaps in her late 40s, with intelligent eyes and a kind smile. I called and made an appointment, using my maiden name for the initial contact, a small act of reclaiming a part of myself that predated Mark, predated the role of mom that had come to define, and nearly erase, me. Walking into Monica's office a week later felt like stepping into a different world. It was calm, tastefully decorated, and her assistant greeted me with genuine warmth. Monica herself was exactly as her picture suggested: professional, empathetic, and exuding a quiet competence. I sat across from her polished mahogany desk, took a deep breath, and began to tell my story. I didn't hold back. I told her about Arthur, about Mark's upbringing, my sacrifices, and then, the overheard conversation, the pressure to sell my home, the brochures for Golden Meadows. I confessed my hurt, my sense of betrayal, but also my newfound resolve. "They think I'm just going to fade away," I said, my voice surprisingly firm. "They see me as an inconvenience, an obstacle to their inheritance. They are waiting for me to die, Mrs. Holloway, and they are not being particularly patient about it." Monica listened intently, her expression serious, but not pitying. She asked pertinent questions, clarifying details about my assets, the house, my savings, Arthur's modest investment portfolio, my pension. She didn't interrupt unnecessarily, allowing me to lay out the full emotional and practical landscape of my predicament. When I finally finished, there was a moment of silence. Then she said, "Eleanor, may I call you Eleanor? What you've experienced is deeply distressing, and sadly, not as uncommon as one might hope. But let me assure you, you are not finished, and you have options. Many options." Her words were like a balm to my wounded spirit. For the first time in weeks, I felt a flicker of hope, a sense of agency. "My primary concern," I explained, "is to protect myself and my assets, to ensure that my final wishes are respected, not dictated by their greed. And frankly, Monica, I want them to understand that they underestimated me." Monica nodded. "That is entirely achievable. We need to review your current will, first and foremost. Do you have a copy?" I did. I'd brought a small briefcase with all my important documents. The will was old, made shortly after Arthur's death, naming Mark as the sole beneficiary of almost everything. Looking at it now, in light of recent events, made me feel physically ill. "This will need to be changed, obviously," I said, my voice tight. "Completely." Monica smiled faintly. "That's usually the first order of business in situations like this. We also need to consider powers of attorney for both financial and healthcare decisions. Are Mark or Susan currently named?" They were. Another relic of a time when I trusted them implicitly. "We'll revoke those immediately and appoint someone you can trust implicitly. Do you have someone in mind? A close friend, another relative?" I thought for a moment. My closest friend, Martha, was wonderful but frail herself. There were distant cousins, but I barely knew them. "Perhaps you could advise me on a professional trustee, or even yourself, for certain matters?" I asked. "We can explore all those avenues," Monica assured me. "The key is to put you back in control. Your house, for example. It's in your name solely." "Yes," Arthur made sure of that. "Good. We can look into options like a living trust, which can help avoid probate and give you more control over its eventual disposition." It can also offer certain protections. The initial consultation lasted nearly 2 hours. Monica explained complex legal terms in plain English, outlined a clear strategy, and most importantly, she validated my feelings. She didn't dismiss my emotional pain, she acknowledged it as a crucial part of the equation. As I left her office that day, I felt lighter than I had in weeks. The path ahead was still daunting, but now I had a guide, a competent and compassionate ally. The first act of my reclamation had begun. I went home, not to the mausoleum Susan had called it, but to my home, Arthur's home, a place I would defend. I started looking at my financial statements with a new eye, not as a dwindling resource for my old age, but as a tool, a means to secure my independence, and perhaps, to make a statement that Mark and Susan would never forget. The quiet fury was still there, but now it was channeled, focused, transformed into a powerful, motivating force. They wanted me to think about my future comfort in Golden Meadows. Instead, I was meticulously planning a future of my own making, on my own terms. The weeks that followed my initial consultation with Monica were filled with a quiet, almost clandestine activity. It felt strangely invigorating, like being a spy in my own life. During the day, when Mark and Susan might call or drop by, I maintained my persona of the slightly frail, somewhat confused elderly mother. I'd feign forgetfulness about small things, sigh about the burdens of the big house, even let Susan help me sort through some old boxes of what she termed clutter, mostly precious memorabilia, that I later carefully repacked and stored securely. I allowed them to believe their campaign of attrition was working, that I was slowly succumbing to their vision of my inevitable decline. Little did they know that in the evenings, or during quiet afternoons when I was ostensibly napping, I was engrossed in a very different kind of sorting and planning. Monica became my confidant and strategist. We had several more meetings, and countless phone calls. The first major step was drafting a new will. This was an intensely emotional process. For so long, Mark had been the sole inheritor of my legacy, the one I imagined carrying on the family name and cherishing our history. To deliberately remove him was a painful act, a severance of a bond one had held sacred. But their words, "Mom won't live forever," and "sell this old mausoleum," echoed in my mind, steeling my resolve. Monica was patient, guiding me through the options. "You don't have to disinherit him completely if you don't wish to, Eleanor," she'd said gently. "There are ways to leave a token amount, or perhaps specific sentimental items." I considered it. Was there anything left of the son I knew? Any spark of the love and respect I deserved? The more I observed Mark and Susan, the clearer the answer became. Their impatience was growing more visible. Susan would make pointed remarks about rising property taxes on such a large, underutilized property. Mark would helpfully bring articles about the booming real estate market in our area. They were like vultures circling, their eyes fixed on the prize. So, I made my decision. "No," I told Monica firmly. "No token amounts. My estate, whatever it may be, will go to those who value not what I have, but who I am. Or, perhaps, to causes Arthur and I believed in." We discussed various charities and animal shelter Arthur had always supported, a literacy program for underprivileged children, even a fund for historical preservation. A small, ironic nod to their disdain for my dusty antiques, the idea of my assets fostering good in the world, rather than funding their Cotswolds fantasy, brought a grim satisfaction. The house was the biggest point of contention, both in my heart and in their greedy eyes. Selling it while I was alive felt like a surrender, yet leaving it to become a source of bitter conflict after my passing was also unappealing. Monica suggested a qualified personal residence trust, QPRT, or a living trust with very specific instructions. We explored putting it into a trust that would allow me to live in it for the rest of my life, after which it would be sold, with the proceeds directed to my chosen beneficiaries. This felt right. It secured my home for my lifetime and ensured Mark and Susan would never get their hands on it. Next, we tackled the powers of attorney. Revoking Mark's authority felt like cutting another cord, but a necessary one. Monica arranged for a trusted professional fiduciary service to be named for financial matters, should I become incapacitated, and for healthcare decisions. I appointed Monica herself as a primary, with a secondary backup, ensuring that any future choices about my well-being would be made with my true best interests at heart, not with an eye on expediency or inheritance. I meticulously went through my finances. Savings accounts, investments, pension details. I consolidated some accounts, moved others to institutions Mark had no connection with. I even changed the beneficiary on my life insurance policy, a modest one Arthur had taken out years ago. It had always been Mark, now, it was designated to cover my final expenses, with any remainder going to the animal shelter. Throughout this period, I had to be incredibly careful. Mark was astute with numbers, and Susan was nosy. I used a new email address for correspondence with Monica, paid her fees from an account they didn't know existed, and kept all new documents locked in a small safe hidden in Arthur's old study, a room they rarely entered, deeming it too gloomy sometimes. The weight of the deception was heavy. I was, by nature, an honest person. This duplicity, even in self-defense, felt alien. But then I would remember Susan's smug smile, as she handed me the Golden Meadows brochure, or the chilling casualness in Mark's voice, as he discussed my mortality, and my resolve would harden again. I was not just protecting my assets, I was protecting my dignity, my very essence. One afternoon, Susan dropped by unannounced. I was at my desk, quickly shuffling some papers from Monica into a drawer as I heard her car pull up. She breezed in, full of false cheer. Just thought I'd see how you're doing, Eleanor. Brought you some organic kale. So good for you. She surveyed the room, her eyes lingering on my desk. Keeping busy, she asked, a little too casually. Oh, just some old letters, dear, I said, my heart thumping. Trying to sort through things. So much paper accumulates over the years, she nodded, seemingly satisfied, but I knew I had to be even more vigilant. Their avarice was making them impatient, and impatience could lead to suspicion. The plan was taking shape, brick by meticulous brick. It was my fortress, built not of stone, but of legal documents, carefully considered decisions, and a mother's broken heart reforged into a shield of resolve. They thought they were managing my decline, but I was managing my ascent, reclaiming my power one signature, one secret meeting at a time. The alliance with Monica Holloway deepened beyond a mere client-lawyer relationship. She became a steadfast source of emotional support, a rational sounding board in a world that had suddenly felt irrational and hostile. During our meetings, after we'd gone through the legal minutiae, the intricate clauses of the new trust documents, the precise wording of the revocations of power of attorney, she would often lean back, her expression softening, and simply ask, "And how are you doing with all this, Eleanor?" Really doing? It was in those moments that the carefully constructed composure I maintained for Mark and Susan would sometimes falter. I'd confess the lingering ache of betrayal, the moments of doubt where I wondered if I was being too harsh, if there was any way to salvage something from the wreckage of my relationship with my son. Monica never judged. She would listen, nod, and then gently remind me of the reasons I had embarked on this path. "You are not being harsh, Eleanor," she'd say, her voice firm but kind. "You are responding to a profound breach of trust. You are protecting yourself and honoring your own worth. What they did, what they said that was harsh, her validation was crucial. It helped to quiet the nagging voice of maternal guilt that sometimes whispered I should forgive, I should forget, I should just let them have what they wanted for the sake of peace. But Monica helped me see that true peace couldn't be built on a foundation of my own diminishment. Beyond Monica, I found myself slowly, cautiously, reaching out in other ways. For years, I had let some of my old friendships wither, caught up in Mark's life, then in my grief for Arthur, and more recently, in a kind of self-imposed isolation, as I sensed the growing distance with my son. One day, I picked up the phone and called Sarah, a friend from my book club days. We hadn't spoken in over a year. Her delight at hearing my voice was a balm. We met for tea the following week. I didn't tell her the full extent of my troubles with Mark and Susan. It felt too raw, too personal to share widely, but I spoke of feeling a bit lost, of wanting to reconnect. Sarah, with her no-nonsense attitude and infectious laugh, was like a breath of fresh air. She reminded me of the woman I used to be, before I became solely Mark's mother, or Arthur's widow. She encouraged me to rejoin the book club, to come to a local art class she attended. Hesitantly, I agreed. Attending that first art class was terrifying. I hadn't picked up a paintbrush since my school days. But the instructor was encouraging, the other students friendly, and I found a surprising solace in mixing colors, in trying to capture the light on a bowl of fruit. It was something just for me, something Mark and Susan knew nothing about, a small act of defiance against their narrative of my decline. These small excursions, these reconnect irons, began to rebuild my confidence. I was still Eleanor, a woman with interests, with capabilities, with a life yet to be lived. My plan, initially focused solely on legal and financial defenses, began to broaden. It wasn't just about what I was taking away from Mark and Susan, it was about what I was building for myself. The more empowered I felt, the clearer my vision for the statement I wanted to make became. It wasn't enough to simply change my will and secure my assets. I wanted them to understand, unequivocally, the consequences of their actions, the depth of their misjudgment. Monica and I began to strategize about the reveal. How and when would they learn of these changes? A posthumous reading of the will felt too passive. I wanted to see their faces, to witness their realization, not out of malice, but out of a need for them to confront the truth of what they had become, and what they had driven me to do. We discussed a formal letter, a meeting. The details were still hazy, but the intent was crystallizing. I continued to feign a gentle decline. When Susan would visit, I'd accidentally leave a Golden Meadows brochure on the coffee table, as if I was seriously considering it. I'd sigh about the stairs being a bit much these days. I saw the flicker of satisfaction in her eyes, the shared, knowing glances between her and Mark. They were convinced their plan was working, that I was slowly being nudged towards the exit they had chosen for me. Their arrogance was, in a strange way, my greatest ally. It blinded them to the quiet revolution taking place right under their noses. I even started making specific, seemingly innocuous requests that played into their assumptions. "Mark, dear," I said one afternoon, "could you perhaps look into getting a valuation for the house? Just for insurance purposes, of course." "It's probably time I updated my policy," he'd readily agreed, a little too eagerly, no doubt imagining how that valuation would translate into his future inheritance. He reported back a week later, a pleased look on his face. "It's worth quite a bit more than we thought, Mom. A very desirable property." "Oh, that's nice to know, dear," I'd murmured, letting my voice trail off, as if the figure was too large for my old mind to comprehend. Inside, I smiled grimly. Desirable indeed. But not for him. Not anymore. The strength I was gathering wasn't just legal or financial, it was emotional, spiritual. I was no longer just reacting to their betrayal, I was proactively shaping my own destiny, writing my own final chapters. And I knew, with a certainty that settled deep in my bones, that the ending would be one they never saw coming. The late autumn air grew crisp, mirroring the chill that had permanently settled in my interactions with Mark and Susan, at least from my side of the carefully constructed facade. They, on the other hand, seemed to grow warmer, more solicitous, as if sensing their long-awaited prize was drawing nearer. Their visits became almost cloyingly attentive. Susan would bring home-baked, or, more likely, store-bought and artfully repackaged, cookies, fussing over my comfort, while Mark would offer to do small repairs around the house, his gaze lingering a little too long on the antique grandfather clock in the hall, or the silver tea service in the dining room cabinet, items he'd never shown the slightest interest in before. It was a grotesque pantomime of familial concern, and it took all my willpower not to shatter the illusion. Their impatience, however, was beginning to fray the edges of their performance. One Saturday morning, Mark called, his voice imbued with a false casualness. "Mom, Susan and I were thinking, we have some friends, a lovely couple, who are looking for a project house, something with good bones, you know. They absolutely adore this neighborhood. Would you mind terribly if they just drove by, maybe had a quick peek from the outside?" My blood ran cold. A peek from the outside. The audacity. But I kept my voice even. "Oh, Mark, I don't know. The house isn't really at its best right now." "Nonsense, Mom, it's charming. They are not expecting perfection. Just an idea of the potential." The word potential hung in the air, heavy with unspoken meaning, potential for them, once I was out of the picture. This was an escalation. They were no longer content to wait. They were actively marketing my home from under me. This incident solidified my timeline. The stage needed to be set for the climax, and soon. I called Monica. "They are getting bolder," I told her. "I think it's time," Monica agreed. "We have everything in place, Eleanor. All your documents are signed, notarized, and securely filed. The new trust is active, the powers of attorney are revoked and reassigned. You are in complete control. The question now is how you want to deliver the news." We had discussed various scenarios. A formal letter from Monica's office. A quiet conversation. But none of those felt quite right. They needed to understand the full scope of their misjudgment, the full weight of their actions. I wanted them to be confronted not by a lawyer's letter, but by me, the woman they had so callously dismissed. "I want to tell them myself," I said. "In my home. This home they are so eager to dispose of." We devised a plan. I would invite Mark and Susan over for a special luncheon. Not for a birthday or anniversary, just an out-of-the-blue invitation that would pique their curiosity, perhaps make them think I was about to make an announcement in their favor, finally agreeing to Golden Meadows, perhaps, or discussing the smooth transition of my assets. The irony was not lost on me. I spent the next week preparing, not just the menu for the luncheon, but myself. I reread every document Monica had prepared, reaffirming my decisions. I spent hours in Arthur's study, not looking at old photographs with sadness, but drawing strength from his memory, from the life we had built together, a life I was now fighting to honor. I chose my outfit for the day with care, a dress in a deep sapphire blue, a color Arthur always said brought out the fire in my eyes. I even wore a necklace he had given me, a simple gold locket. I felt a strange calmness settle over me, the calm before a storm, perhaps, but a storm of my own making. I sent out the invitation, "My dearest Mark and Susan, I would be so pleased if you would join me for a small luncheon next Saturday, at 1 o'clock. There are a few things I'd like to discuss. With love, Mom." The "with love" felt like a small, sharp stone in my mouth, but it was part of the act. Mark called almost immediately, his voice full of carefully modulated concern and barely concealed eagerness. "Of course, Mom. Is everything all right? You want to discuss something? Everything is fine, dear, I assured him. Just a few things I'd like to share with you both. We'll be there, he said, and I could almost hear Susan whispering excitedly in the background. The week leading up to that Saturday was surreal. I moved through my days with a heightened awareness, every detail of my home, every scent from my garden, feeling precious and imbued with significance. I was saying a quiet goodbye to one chapter of my life and preparing to step boldly into another. Monica was on standby. We agreed that she wouldn't be present at the luncheon itself. This was something I needed to do on my own. But she would be available by phone immediately afterward, and all the legal groundwork was unshakably in place. On the morning of the luncheon, I rose early. The house was quiet, filled with the soft morning light. I arranged flowers from the garden, set the dining room table with my best china, the china Susan had once dismissed as terribly old-fashioned. I prepared a simple but elegant meal, poached salmon, asparagus with hollandaise, and a lemon tart for dessert. Every action was deliberate, mindful. This wasn't just a meal, it was a stage setting. As I worked, I thought of their faces, their shock, their inevitable disbelief. There was no pleasure in this anticipation, only a grim sense of necessity. They had sown the wind, they were about to reap the whirlwind. The doorbell rang precisely at 1 o'clock. My heart gave a small lurch, but I smoothed my dress, took a deep breath, and walked to answer it. There they stood, Mark and Susan, wreathed in smiles that didn't quite reach their eyes. "Mom? You look wonderful," Mark exclaimed, a little too heartily. Susan presented me with a bottle of wine, her eyes flicking around the hallway, already assessing, calculating. "This is such a lovely surprise, Eleanor," she trilled. "We've been so looking forward to it. Come in, I said, my voice betraying none of the turmoil within. "Lunch is almost ready." The trap was set. The players were in position. The final act was about to begin. We sat down to lunch in the dining room, the sunlight streaming through the tall windows, illuminating the very dusty antiques Susan so despised. The conversation was initially stilted, filled with forced pleasantries. Mark commented on the weather, Susan complimented the flowers. They were both palpably expectant, waiting for me to broach the few things I wanted to discuss. I let them wait, serving the salmon, pouring the wine I'd chosen, a crisp Sancerre, not the one Susan had brought, which I suspected was a cheap vintage meant to impress. I spoke of mundane things, the book club, my art class, a minor repair the gardener had made. I saw their impatience growing, the subtle tapping of Susan's fingers on the table, the way Mark kept clearing his throat. Finally, as I served the lemon tart, Susan could contain herself no longer. "Eleanor," she began, her voice sweet as saccharine, "Mark mentioned you had a few things you wanted to talk about." "We are all ears, of course." "Anything we can do to help," Mark chimed in. "Yes, Mom. We are here for you." Whatever it is, this was it. I took a small bite of my tart, savoring the sharp sweetness, then placed my fork down carefully. I looked from Mark to Susan, my gaze steady. "Yes," I said, my voice calm, measured. "There are a few things. Important things." I saw them lean forward slightly, their expressions a mixture of feigned concern and ill-concealed anticipation. They probably thought I was about to announce my decision to move to Golden Meadows, or perhaps ask for their help in selling the house. "Firstly," I began, "I want to thank you both for your input regarding my future living arrangements and the disposition of this house." Susan beamed. "Of course, Eleanor. We only want what's best for you." "I've given it a great deal of thought," I continued, my eyes holding Mark's. "A very great deal of thought. Especially since that day I overheard you, Mark, telling Susan that I wouldn't live forever, and Susan, your rather enthusiastic agreement about selling this old mausoleum for your Cotswolds dream. The air in the room changed instantly. The smiles froze on their faces. Mark's complexion went from ruddy to a sickly pale. Susan's mouth opened slightly, then snapped shut. The silence was thick, broken only by the ticking of the grandfather clock in the hall. "Mom. What are you talking about?" Mark stammered, his eyes darting nervously towards his wife. "Oh, I think you know exactly what I'm talking about, Mark," I said, my voice still quiet, but now edged with steel. I was in the sunroom. The door was ajar. I heard everything. Susan found her voice first, a brittle, defensive tone. "Eleanor, you must have misunderstood. We would never." "Misunderstood?" I interrupted, a small, humorless smile playing on my lips. "Misunderstood the relief in your voices. Misunderstood the detailed plans for spending the proceeds of my home, before I'm even cold in my grave." "No, Susan, I don't think I misunderstood at all." I paused, letting the weight of my words sink in. "Your concern for my well-being has been illuminating. The brochures for Golden Meadows. The helpful suggestions to downsize. The casual inquiries about my finances. It all makes perfect sense now." I reached for a slim leather-bound folder I had placed on the sideboard earlier. "Which brings me to the other things I wanted to discuss." I opened the folder. "As you know, I've been getting my affairs in order. And in doing so, I've made a few changes. With the help of my solicitor, Ms. Monica Holloway, I have executed a new last will and testament." Mark's eyes widened. Susan gasped audibly. "My previous will, which named you, Mark, as the primary beneficiary, has been revoked. In its place, this new will directs that my entire estate, including this house, or rather, the proceeds from its sale after my passing, as it is now held in a living trust for my benefit during my lifetime, will be distributed among several charities that Arthur and I held dear, and a small educational fund I've established." The color drained completely from Mark's face. He looked like he'd been punched. Susan's expression was a mask of disbelief and dawning fury. You can't do that," she hissed, her voice rising. "This house is Mark's birthright. It's family." "Family?" I queried, raising an eyebrow. "Is that what this is about, Susan? Family? Or is it about what you perceive as your entitlement? This house was mine and Arthur's. It represents our life, our work. And it will be used to honor that memory, not to fund your extravagant lifestyle on the assumption of my timely demise." I then produced another set of documents. "Furthermore," I continued, my voice unwavering, "the powers of attorney I had previously granted to you, Mark, for both financial and healthcare matters, have also been revoked. Ms. Holloway and a professional fiduciary are now responsible for those, should the need arise. You will no longer be making any decisions regarding my assets or my personal care." Mark finally spoke, his voice hoarse, laced with a desperation I had never heard from him before. "Mom, why? After everything, how could you? How could I?" I echoed, the pain of years, the fresh wound of their betrayal, welling up, but not overwhelming my resolve. "Perhaps you should ask yourself that question, Mark. How could you speak of your mother's death with such anticipation? How could you plot to dispose of her home, her memories, with such cold calculation? You and Susan made it abundantly clear that you see me as a burden, an obstacle. You thought I was too old, too frail, too blind to see what you were doing. You underestimated me." I stood up, the folder still in my hand. "The lunch is over. I think it's best if you both leave now." Susan shot to her feet, her face contorted with rage. "You'll regret this, you old fool. We'll fight this. Mark is your son." "He is," I acknowledged, a deep sadness touching me then, a grief for the son I had lost long before this day. And I am his mother. The mother he was ready to discard. As for fighting it, feel free. Miss Holloway is an excellent lawyer, and my wishes are ironclad. My mental capacity is, as you can now clearly see, perfectly intact. Mark just sat there, slumped in his chair, staring blankly at the lemon tart, the picture of utter devastation. Susan grabbed his arm. Mark! Don't just sit there. Say something. He looked up at me, his eyes filled with a mixture of shock, shame, and a dawning, terrible understanding. But he said nothing. He simply allowed Susan to pull him to his feet. They left without another word, the sound of the front door closing behind them echoing through the suddenly quiet house. I stood there for a long moment, the folder in my hand, a tremor finally running through me. It was done. The bomb had been dropped. The shockwaves were only just beginning. The silence that descended after Mark and Susan's departure was profound, a stark contrast to the emotional tempest that had just swept through my dining room. I sank back into my chair, my legs suddenly weak. The adrenaline that had coursed through me, lending me strength and clarity, began to ebb, leaving behind a bone-deep weariness, but also an immense, undeniable sense of relief. It was over. The secret I had carried for months, the meticulous planning, the carefully constructed facade, it had all culminated in that one, devastating confrontation. I picked up my teacup, my hand trembling slightly, and took a sip of the now-cold tea. The lemon tart on Mark's plate remained untouched, a small, poignant symbol of the bitter feast they had unknowingly attended. My first call was to Monica. I recounted the events, my voice still a little shaky but firm. She listened patiently, and when I had finished, there was a moment of quiet on her end. "You did it, Eleanor," she said softly, a note of admiration in her voice. "You stood your ground. How are you feeling?" "Exhausted," I admitted. "And strangely peaceful. Sad, too, in a way. He's still my son, after all, or he made his choices, Eleanor. And you made yours, to protect yourself and your dignity. You have every right to feel peace in that." We discussed the potential fallout. Monica anticipated they might try to contest the new will or the revocation of the power of attorney, perhaps claiming undue influence or lack of capacity on my part. "Let them try," Monica said, her tone confident. "Our documentation is meticulous. Your capacity is demonstrably sound today proved that beyond any doubt. They don't have a legal leg to stand on." Her reassurance was comforting. The next few days were quiet. Eerily so. I half expected angry phone calls, pleading messages, or even an unannounced visit from a furious Mark and Susan. But there was nothing. Silence. It was the silence of shock, I suspected, of their world being utterly upended. I imagined them huddled together, dissecting what had happened, Susan's initial rage likely giving way to frantic calculations, Mark grappling with a complex brew of shame, anger, and perhaps, just perhaps, a flicker of remorse. I didn't dwell on it. I focused on myself, on the small routines that had always grounded me. I tended my garden, the late roses still bravely blooming despite the autumn chill. I attended my art class, finding a new freedom in my brushstrokes. I met Sarah for coffee, and though I still didn't share the full drama, she sensed a change in me, a lightness, a renewed spark. "You seem different, Ellie," she'd remarked, her head tilted. "Good different. Like a weight has been lifted," and it had. A monumental weight. About a week after the luncheon, I received a letter. It was from a law firm I didn't recognize. My heart did a little flip, but I opened it calmly. It was, as Monica had predicted, a formal inquiry from lawyers engaged by Mark and Susan, questioning the validity of my recent estate planning changes, and requesting full disclosure of my financial and medical records. They were challenging me. I immediately forwarded it to Monica. Her response was swift and decisive. She drafted a polite, but firm reply, stating that my legal affairs were in perfect order, that I was under no obligation to disclose personal records to them, and that any further attempts to harass or intimidate me would be met with appropriate legal action. That letter, I later learned, effectively ended their bluster. Faced with Monica's unwavering professionalism and the clear legality of my actions, their challenge crumbled. There were no more legal letters. The silence from Mark and Susan resumed, but this time it felt less like the quiet before a storm and more like the stillness of defeat. The immediate aftermath was also about reclaiming my space, both physically and emotionally. I walked through my house, and it felt different. No longer a mausoleum waiting to be plundered, but a sanctuary, a testament to my life with Arthur, and now, a symbol of my own resilience. I began to make small changes, things I'd put off. I had the sagging porch railing repaired, not because Mark had pointed it out with his assessor's eye, but because I wanted it fixed, for my own pleasure and safety. I even considered painting the window frames, perhaps in a cheerful blue. The sense of justice was profound. It wasn't a gloating triumph, but a quiet, deep satisfaction that I had stood up to their greed and disrespect, that I had not allowed them to diminish me or erase my legacy. The healing was beginning, a slow, gentle process. The wound of Mark's betrayal would likely always be there, a scar on my heart, but it no longer defined me. I was Eleanor Vance, a woman who had faced down her own family's avarice and emerged stronger, more resolute, and in control of her own destiny. The peace I felt was hard-won, and all the more precious for it. My new life was beginning, built on the foundations of truth and self-respect. The months that followed were a period of quiet recalibration, of settling into a new rhythm. The silence from Mark and Susan stretched on, becoming a permanent fixture in our severed relationship. I heard nothing from them directly, not a call, not a card, not even on my birthday or during the holidays. It was a silence that spoke volumes, a testament to their bitterness, their inability to face the consequences of their own actions, or perhaps their profound shame. Occasionally, I'd hear snippets about them through the grapevine of distant family acquaintances or old neighborhood friends who still had some contact. The stories were invariably tinged with a certain schadenfreude from the tellers, though I tried not to indulge in that myself. It seemed their Cotswolds dream had evaporated, along with their expected inheritance. Rumor had it they were facing financial difficulties. Mark's career, once a source of pride, had apparently stalled, and Susan's aspirations for a life of leisured luxury were proving elusive. They had, it seemed, been banking heavily on my demise and the subsequent windfall. Their miscalculation had cost them dearly, not just financially, but in terms of their reputation among those who eventually pieced together the story of their callousness. There was a certain poetic justice in their struggles, a direct consequence of their greed and their profound underestimation of the quiet, elderly woman they had sought to manipulate. I didn't rejoice in their misfortune, but I didn't grieve for them either. They had made their choices, and now they were living with them. My life, in contrast, blossomed in unexpected ways. With the legal battles behind me and my future secure, I felt a sense of freedom I hadn't experienced in decades. I sold the large Victorian house, not under duress or to fund their fantasies, but on my own terms, when I was ready. It was a bittersweet parting, filled with memories of Arthur and a younger Mark, but I knew it was time. The upkeep was becoming a burden, and more importantly, I wanted a fresh start, a home that was entirely mine, untainted by recent shadows. I found a lovely smaller cottage in a quiet coastal town, a place I'd always dreamed of living, with a small garden perfect for a few rose bushes, and a view of the sea. It was peaceful, manageable, and filled with light. Monica handled the sale of the old house, and the proceeds, as per the terms of my living trust, were securely invested, providing me with a comfortable income and ensuring my charitable bequests would be substantial. I dedicated more time to my art, even selling a few paintings at a local gallery. I traveled a little, something Arthur and I had always wanted to do more of but never quite managed. I visited old friends and made new ones in my coastal community. I volunteered at the local animal shelter, finding immense joy in caring for abandoned creatures, a stark contrast to the abandonment I had felt from my own son. My life was full, not with the drama of family betrayal, but with quiet joys, meaningful connections, and a profound sense of peace. I often reflected on the journey I had been through. The initial shock and pain of Mark and Susan's words, the crushing weight of their betrayal, had been almost unbearable. But from that crucible of suffering, a new strength had been forged. I had learned that I was more resilient, more capable, and more powerful than I had ever imagined. I had learned that it was never too late to reclaim one's dignity, to rewrite one's own story. The memory of Mark's words, "Mom won't live forever," no longer brought a stab of pain, but a wry, knowing smile. He was right, of course. None of us live forever. But he and Susan would certainly remember me. They wouldn't remember the frail, fading mother they had envisioned, the compliant old woman easily ushered aside. They would remember Eleanor Vance, the woman who saw through their schemes, who stood up to their greed, and who, with quiet determination and meticulous planning, secured her own legacy and taught them an unforgettable lesson about respect, love, and the enduring strength of the human spirit. They would remember me not for when I died, but for how I chose to live, especially in those final, decisive chapters. And in that, I found my ultimate vindication, my lasting peace. My life was now my own, rich and fulfilling, a testament to the fact that even in the deepest shadows of betrayal, one can find the path back to the light, emerging not just intact, but transformed. And that, I believe, is a legacy worth remembering.